Senator Ricketts.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. I want to keep building upon one of the things we touched upon a little bit earlier with regard to missiles. At the Washington NATO summit, the Biden administration announced they're going to start deploying long-range missiles to Germany beginning in 2026. Secretary, do you agree that deploying these conventional missile systems capable of threatening military targets deep inside of Russia strengthens NATO's defense posture and complicates Russian planning efforts?
Absolutely.
So, since Putin began his illegal war in Ukraine, Russia's fired numerous cruise and ballistic missiles into Ukraine, oftentimes targeting civilians from deep inside Russian territory. The Biden administration has actually prevented Ukraine from using a lot of the U.S. weapons to strike back at these military targets in Russia. In May, the administration reluctantly eased some of these restrictions, allowing HIMARS strikes on targets, in the border, across the border, as Russia was posing a significant threat and making gains in Kharkiv. However, these restrictions on Ukraine's use of long-range ATACMS on targets inside of Russia remain. If deploying long-range missiles in Germany is critical to NATO's deterrence by threatening military targets deep inside of Russia, then why doesn't the same logic apply to Ukraine and its ability to do the same with U.S. weapons and other Western-provided weaponry? Why shouldn't they be allowed to strike these targets inside of Russia?
Senator, I think some of this is probably best for a military briefing, but I'd just say as a general principle, we want Ukraine to use the weapons it has in the places they can do the most damage. For the last several months, that has been driving Russian firing positions back and denying it the ability to use Crimea essentially as a giant aircraft carrier threatening Ukraine. And Ukraine's been incredibly successful in that as a strategy. What the president said, when asked about this at the end of the NATO summit, was that we'll continue to talk with Ukraine about the best way to use the weapons, given the situation on the battlefield at the time.
Well, at the NATO summit, the president, I think, also said when he was defending his unwillingness to expand this policy, saying if Zelensky had the capacity to strike Moscow, strike the Kremlin, that wouldn't make sense, wouldn't? But to your knowledge, has the Ukraine asked to be able to use U.S. weapons to strike Moscow?
If I knew that, I couldn't talk about it in this setting. No, I think the conversation that happens in military channels is very professional and focused on the actual situation in the battlefield. And again, we are looking for the use of these weapons, which there's not an infinite number of these weapons, so we're looking for them to be used in the sequence that does the most damage and in the places that will protect the most people.
Where I'm going with those, not necessarily military. What I'm talking about is how do we deter Russia from these kinds of things in the first place? And if we believe that having long-range weapons is going to help deter Russia, and we give Ukraine the ability to start striking targets deep inside of Russia, doesn't that seem to make sense? That would also help deter Russia. And if we provided them the ability to do this, it doesn't mean that they even have the capability to strike Moscow, but would give them the ability to strike targets such as air bases and munitions and all that sort of thing that would help us there. And my question would then be, by allowing some of these things, are we seeing a significant escalation from Putin? Do we see that with some of these things? We're seeing an escalation from Putin if we're giving the Ukrainians more freedom to be able to prosecute the war?
To this point, the escalation we've seen from President Putin is a willingness to strike civilian targets, including children's cancer hospital, places that are known to be schools. So that is the escalation we're seeing. The reason we adopted the policy we have is, I know some people talk about an escalation ladder concern. I've got to say, inside the government, the conversation is about where can these things be effective. And Ukraine has its own weapons, which occasionally have been used to strike well beyond the limitations, even the physical limits, range limits of the weapons the U.S. has. And there they choose sometimes to use them in these long-range areas, and sometimes they focus nearer to hand because that is the immediate need. And as the president said, we'll keep at this.
Well, so what I hear you saying is that it's really not about the escalation, though the president said along the lines of it wouldn't be a good idea to allow Ukraine to be able to strike Moscow. So to me, that says that is about escalation, even though I don't believe Ukraine has plans to try to use our weapons to try, or even capability to strike, Moscow with it. And I think what we ought to do is allow the Ukrainians to be able to fight this war so they can win by hitting those military targets deep inside of Russia. Let them use the ATACMS in a way that can be the most effective as hitting those targets. And, stop slow rolling this, give them the opportunity to be able to win. And I'd encourage the administration to do that, because I think that's the fastest way to be able to get a victory here. So I've run over my time. I'll turn it back over. Thank you.